Hello friends, I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? I'm always curious to imagine people in different corners of the world. Some just waking up, some preparing for bed, some maybe sitting in a quiet room with headphones on, letting their mind drift away. Wherever you are, tonight we are going to step into another time and another world to discover what life in the Middle Ages was like. Starting with something simple but surprisingly revealing: breakfast. Now, when you picture breakfast today, you might imagine coffee, perhaps a slice of toast, maybe eggs, or something sweet like pancakes. But in the Middle Ages, the first meal of the day was not so straightforward. In fact, for much of medieval Europe, there wasn't even a clear word for breakfast in the way we use it today. People simply ate when it was time and what they had on hand, and the way they thought about food was different from us. This is one of those fascinating details because how people eat tells us everything about how they live, how they work, and even how they think about the world. Imagine waking up in a small stone cottage, the air still cold from the night. There is no alarm clock, no glowing digital screen. You rise with the sun, or with the rooster's crow, or perhaps even earlier if you're a farmer and need to prepare the fields. The first thing you might do is stir the embers in the hearth, hoping to coax a little warmth from the ashes left over from last night's fire. Without fire, there is no cooking. Without cooking, there is no meal. Already, food is tied to survival in a much more immediate way than most of us experience today. So what did people eat first thing in the morning? Well, for peasants, it might be a piece of coarse bread, baked days before and hardened by time. Bread was the foundation of life, the staff of life as they called it, but it wasn't soft and fluffy like modern loaves. It was dense, heavy, and dark, often made from rye, barley, or oats instead of fine white wheat, which was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Alongside this bread, there might be a bit of ale, weak in alcohol but safer than water. Medieval people drank ale at almost every meal, even children, because water could easily carry disease. So yes, you can imagine even the youngest sipping from a mug of ale in the morning before heading out to tend the animals or walk to church. Now, here's a detail that might surprise you. The church, and religion in general, had enormous influence over when and what people ate. There were fasting days, rules about meat, and even debates about whether eating in the morning was a sign of greed or laziness. For a long time, monks debated whether a morning meal should even be permitted. Eventually, the idea of a simple early meal became more accepted, but it was often humble: porridge, bread soaked in milk, perhaps some cheese if you were lucky. And here's another hook. If you were wealthy, things looked very different. Imagine being in a castle hall, with long wooden tables and servants carrying trays. A lord or a lady might begin the day with white bread, honey, fresh butter, and sometimes meat or fish, depending on the season and the day's rules. Spices like cinnamon or pepper could appear, rare and precious, brought from faraway lands through dangerous trade routes. For the wealthy, even breakfast could be a way to show status. But for the average villager, breakfast was not about luxury, it was about fuel. Farming required energy, and bread and ale were quick solutions. Sometimes, leftovers from the previous night's dinner were eaten cold. Think about that. No refrigeration, no modern storage. Leftovers meant salted meat, dried fish, or a bit of stew kept near the fire overnight. The morning meal was less about flavor and more about getting by. Still, even in these humble meals, there are stories hidden. For example, the way bread was baked tells us about community. Many villages had a shared oven, and families would take turns baking loaves together. The smell of fresh bread could fill an entire street, and bread became not just a food, but a social bond. So, when you picture that first bite of bread in the morning, you can also picture the effort of kneading, baking, and sharing among neighbors. And yet, there's more to the story than just food. Breakfast also tells us about time. Imagine that most people worked from sunrise to sunset without electric light. Eating early wasn't just about hunger. It was about preparing for hours of hard labor ahead. Children, too, would share in this, eating what their parents ate before heading into the fields, or learning trades, or even beginning long journeys to monasteries or towns. Life was slower, but it was also relentless. Now here's something fascinating. Many medieval people didn't even think of breakfast as essential. Some considered it a habit of the week. In fact, it wasn't until the later Middle Ages that breakfast became common in many places. Before that, some people would wait until midday for their first proper meal, which they called dinner. So when we talk about breakfast in the Middle Ages, we're really talking about a practice that shifted, evolved, and meant different things depending on your station, your region, and even the rules of your faith. And this is just the beginning. Because when we peel back the layers of breakfast, we don't just see food. We see medieval kitchens, where smoke curled up to the rafters because there were no chimneys in early homes. We see wooden bowls, rough spoons, and knives carried on belts, because forks were not yet in use. We see how food shaped daily rhythms, how it linked to trade, to war, to disease, to survival. And perhaps most importantly, we see how something as ordinary as eating bread in the morning can open a window into an entire lost world. So let's keep walking through this world together. From the bread on the peasant's table, to the honey on the Lord's plate, to the rules whispered by monks in their cloisters, breakfast is just the doorway into the deeper story of medieval life. As we move further into the kitchens and halls of the Middle Ages, the picture of breakfast begins to expand, and with it, the small details that tell us so much about daily life. Imagine again that quiet moment in a medieval home before the bustle of work has fully begun. A simple wooden table sits near the fire, uneven from years of use. On it rests a loaf of bread, perhaps cracked and dusty with flour, a clay jug of ale, and a small knife used not only for food but for countless other tasks. Eating was not as private or individual as it is today. Families often gathered together, and meals were shared from common dishes. You might dip your bread into the same bowl of pottage, a kind of thick stew, as your neighbor or your child, and no one thought twice about it. Pottage itself is worth pausing on. It was one of the defining dishes of medieval Europe, eaten not just at breakfast but throughout the day. At its simplest, it was made of oats or barley boiled in water, flavored with whatever vegetables were at hand. Onions, leeks, cabbages, maybe peas or beans. Sometimes herbs were thrown in for taste, and if you were lucky enough to have a scrap of meat or a bone left from the previous evening, it might be boiled with the grains, adding precious flavor and a bit of fat. The texture was thick, hearty, and filling, perfect for sustaining someone through long hours of labor. In the morning, leftover pottage could be reheated or even eaten cold, with a crust of bread to soak it up. But pottage was not merely food, it was a symbol of endurance. Think about the rhythm of a year in a medieval village. During summer and autumn, when crops and gardens were abundant, pottage might be rich with fresh vegetables and herbs. During the cold months of winter, however, it could become little more than a thin gruel, flavored faintly by dried peas or turnips stored in root cellars. Each spoonful carried the story of the seasons, of harvests and shortages, of survival and patience. So when someone in the 13th century began their day with a bowl of pottage, they were also tasting the rhythm of their land and their labor. Now let's shift our gaze for a moment to the monasteries, where monks lived under strict rules that shaped their meals. In many orders, breakfast was not common, because eating before a certain hour was considered indulgent. Yet exceptions often arose. For example, monks who performed hard labor, tending gardens, copying manuscripts by candlelight, or working in the fields, might be granted a small morning portion of bread and ale to sustain them. Sometimes a bit of cheese or fish would be permitted. The rules varied between different monastic traditions, And these details give us a sense of how food was never just physical. It was deeply tied to moral and spiritual life. Even deciding whether to eat in the morning was seen as a decision about discipline and virtue. Meanwhile, in the towns and cities that were slowly growing across Europe, breakfast began to take on new forms. Bakers opened early to serve those who needed bread before setting off to work. Markets buzzed with vendors selling small items that could be eaten quickly: roasted chestnuts, fresh fruit in season, or even warm pies filled with meat or vegetables. For travelers passing through, an inn might serve a modest morning meal, often accompanied by ale or weak wine. Inns were noisy, crowded, and full of stories. Merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers all crossing paths. Eating breakfast in such a place was less about comfort and more about necessity, but it added another layer to the tapestry of medieval mornings. And we mustn't forget the nobles, whose mornings carried a very different rhythm. For them, breakfast was often an opportunity to display wealth without even trying. A noble household might begin the day with trenchers of fine white bread made from the purest wheat flour, sieved to remove the bran, soft and pale, a luxury that peasants rarely even saw. Honey drizzled over butter might follow, and perhaps even spiced wine, though it was early. Imagine the surprise of tasting cinnamon or nutmeg in the 12th century, flavors carried across continents by merchants braving deserts and seas. Each sprinkle of spice on a noble's table carried the echo of distant lands, the risk of pirates, the toil of caravans. To taste such a spice at breakfast was to declare one's wealth and status to anyone watching. But there was something else woven into the story of breakfast: belief and superstition. People in the Middle Ages saw food not only as nourishment but as something with meaning, sometimes even magical meaning. Certain foods were believed to warm the body or balance the humors, those mysterious fluids that medieval doctors thought governed health. A leek eaten in the morning might be thought to purify the blood. Garlic could protect against illness, and onions were believed to strengthen the body against the chill of winter. Even the humblest breakfast could carry a layer of unseen meaning, connecting everyday life with the larger mysteries of health and fate. Let's not forget children. What did they eat in the mornings? Much the same as their parents. A small piece of bread, a bit of porridge if it was available, and sometimes milk. Sweet foods were rare, but honey, when available, was given as a treat, sometimes spread on bread to create something surprisingly close to what we would now call a breakfast snack. Picture a child's delight as they lick honey from their fingers. A small joy in a life that otherwise demanded hard work from a very early age. And then there is the curious detail of timing. Not everyone ate early. Some people rose with the sun but worked for hours before eating their first bite. Others, especially those in towns with access to markets, might grab something quickly as they began their day. In this way, breakfast was flexible, shifting with need, season, and circumstance. It was not fixed, not defined, and yet it was always present in some form. The deeper you look, the more breakfast becomes a lens into everything else. Class, religion, medicine, trade, childhood, family. Even the act of drinking ale in the morning reminds us of how different their world was from ours. A world where water could kill and beer was safer than a stream. And yet, despite all these differences, there is something familiar, almost comforting, in imagining a family gathered around a fire, breaking bread together, beginning their day with the same small ritual that still connects us all: eating. When we think about breakfast in the Middle Ages, it is easy to imagine the bread, the ale, the porridge, but there is another element that quietly shaped the experience of morning meals: the setting. The environment where people ate reveals just as much as the food itself. Imagine for a moment a peasant's cottage. The roof is thatched, the floor is packed earth, and the hearth is the heart of the room. Smoke curls upward, though there is no chimney to carry it out, so it lingers in the air, leaving a smell that clings to clothes and food alike. The morning light filters in through a small opening, not glass but perhaps a shutter of wood or oiled parchment stretched across a frame. Around the hearth, the family gathers, not at a table with chairs like we picture today, but often sitting on benches, stools, or even the floor. The morning meal is not elaborate. It is simple, quiet, and shared. Contrast this with the setting of a castle. A noble's household wakes not to the sound of roosters, but to the bustle of servants. Fires are lit in the great hall, and tables are prepared. While the lord and lady may not always eat immediately, when they do, it is with a degree of formality. Trenchers of bread, thick slices used as edible plates, are set down, and fine cups of metal or carved would hold drinks. Candles or torches might still burn, even in the morning, casting a warm glow over carved beams and tapestries. The food is richer, yes, but the setting itself, grand and imposing, tells us how meals were also statements of power and refinement. Breakfast could be as much about being seen as about being fed. Now let's turn to the sounds. In a village, the morning meal is accompanied by the creak of wooden doors, the clatter of tools being readied for the day, the distant bleating of goats or the lowing of cows waiting to be milked. You might hear the scraping of knives on bread crust, or the bubbling of a pot reheated from the night before. In a monastery, the morning meal, if allowed, would be taken in silence, as part of the discipline of the order. Imagine dozens of monks sitting together, each with a small portion of bread, cheese, or ale, the only sound being the soft clink of vessels or the shuffle of robes. For them, even eating was a form of devotion, a rhythm of life tied to prayer. There is also the question of who ate when. Not every household ate together. In larger households, servants might eat separately from their masters, often earlier and with simpler food. A servant might begin the day with coarse bread and ale before tending to the horses or preparing meals for their lord. Children, too, did not always eat at the same time as adults. In some households, they ate earlier with smaller portions, leaving the adults to dine later. The structure of a breakfast could reflect the structure of society itself, layered, unequal, and defined by duty. And then there were travelers. Roads in the Middle Ages were long, rough, and often dangerous. Imagine a pilgrim waking at dawn, wrapped in a cloak, rising from a hard bed in an inn or even the floor of a stranger's house. Breakfast might be little more than a crust of bread carried from the day before, softened in ale or water. For those on journeys, the morning meal was survival, a chance to gather strength for miles of walking ahead. Inn sometimes provided a morning bite, but it was rarely generous. Bread, perhaps a bit of cheese, maybe a small piece of dried fish. Yet even this, in the cold air of a dawn journey, could feel like a blessing. Let's not forget the role of seasons. In summer, mornings were bright, and breakfast might include fresh berries, apples, or plums, picked from trees or bushes near the home. In winter, however, breakfast could be bleak. Bread grown harder from the cold, porridge made from stored grains, salted meat pulled from a barrel if supplies allowed. Hunger was sharper in winter, and the first meal of the day might be smaller, more stretched than in the warm months. The rhythm of nature dictated what was possible. There are fascinating little customs hidden in this as well. For example, bread was sometimes dipped in ale or wine to soften it, a practice that feels strangely close to our modern idea of cereal with milk. Cheese was often eaten in the morning not only because it was filling but because it kept well, lasting for days or weeks in a time without refrigeration. Eggs were eaten, though not daily, since chickens did not produce eggs as constantly as modern breeds do. An egg, when served in the morning, was a modest but valuable addition, boiled or fried in a pan over the fire. Here is a curious fact. Some medieval doctors advised against eating too early. They believed that the body needed time to wake before it could properly digest food. Too early a meal, they warned, might cause illness. And yet, for laborers, ignoring breakfast was not practical. When hours of fieldwork lay ahead, food was essential. The advice of scholars often clashed with the needs of workers, and life found its balance somewhere in between. And still, we can sense a thread of continuity. To eat together in the morning, whether with bread and ale or porridge and fruit, was not just about feeding the body. It was about beginning the day with others, sharing the first quiet moments before work and noise took over. It was about the comfort of routine, of knowing that each morning began with something familiar, however simple. Even in the smallest details, breakfast revealed much about medieval values. It was humble, communal, and often guided by necessity. It reflected class divisions, yet also the shared truth that everyone, from peasant to noble, needed to eat. The foods may have differed, but the act of breaking bread in the morning connected every household, every monastery, every inn across the continent. So as the sun rose higher, as fields called to be plowed, as markets opened, and as bells rang from church towers, that first meal lingered as the quiet foundation of the day. And from there, the story of medieval life unfolded, each hour bringing new tasks, new meals, and new customs, all of which trace back to that simple act of eating in the morning. As the morning stretches on, the first meal of the day fades, but its influence lingers, shaping the rhythm of the day ahead. In villages and towns alike, the sounds of life slowly rise. Carts creak over cobblestones, blacksmiths hammer metal in the forge, the braying of donkeys echoes through narrow streets. But for a few brief moments, after bread has been broken and ale sipped, people inhabit a quieter space, a space where the small rituals of eating connect them to the land, to each other, and to the invisible web of custom and belief that governs medieval life. Imagine a family in a modest home. The father is about to leave for the fields, carrying a simple tool, perhaps a spade or a scythe. The mother will tend the chickens and the garden. Children might help with chores or begin learning a trade. Breakfast, in this sense, is more than nourishment, it is preparation. Each bite of bread, each sip of weak ale, each bowl of thick pottage carries energy, strength, and resilience, fueling bodies for labor that can last from sunrise until sunset. Unlike today, when meals can be leisurely and flavored with choices and preferences, medieval breakfast is inseparable from survival, from duty, from the unrelenting rhythm of life itself. And yet, it is fascinating to see how creativity and improvisation crept into even the humblest meals. If a baker had left a few scraps of dough, these could be formed into small cakes, baked quickly over the fire, perhaps sprinkled with a bit of honey or dried fruit. Nuts, when available, could be crushed and mixed into porridge or bread, adding texture, flavor, and richness. Even in a world without modern conveniences, people found ways to make breakfast more than mere sustenance, to bring small pleasures into the morning. These small innovations were often passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, from parent to child, forming a subtle network of culinary knowledge. The story grows more complex when we consider the role of religion. Fasting and feast days punctuated the calendar, and they could completely change what was eaten in the morning. On certain fast days, even the simplest foods might be restricted. No meat, no dairy, sometimes not even eggs. Bread and vegetables might remain, but the richness of flavor was curtailed by piety. Conversely, feast days, rare and eagerly awaited, could transform breakfast into a small celebration. Honeyed bread, cheese, fruit preserved in sugar, even small pastries or cakes. The morning meal thus became an early reflection of the larger social and religious cycles, teaching patience, obedience, and, occasionally, delight. Meanwhile, in cities where trade was increasing, new foods began to arrive, changing the textures and tastes of breakfast. Traders brought spices from distant lands, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and though these were costly, small amounts could flavor bread, cheese, or early porridge, adding a sense of luxury and novelty. Dried fruits, almonds, and sugar, though rare, began to trickle into urban kitchens, creating a bridge between simple, local traditions and the growing cosmopolitan tastes of the medieval elite. Even peasants sometimes glimpsed these foods, perhaps in a market, perhaps as a gift or payment, and the idea of a morning meal began to expand beyond mere sustenance into something more imaginative. And then there were the taverns and inns, scattered along roads that connected towns and cities. For travelers, the morning meal was often the first taste of hospitality, however modest. Bread, cheese, and perhaps some leftover meat or a bit of porridge could be served in a hall crowded with other early risers. Merchants preparing for their trade, pilgrims setting out on journeys, soldiers on the move. Inns were noisy, warm from fires, and filled with smells of cooked food, smoke, and the straw that lined the floors. Breakfast here was functional, yes, but it also offered a rare chance for conversation and social connection. Travelers exchanged news, rumors, and advice. Even gossip about distant courts, battles, or markets, while sharing a simple meal before moving on. Children's breakfasts reveal yet another layer. Their food mirrored the adults, but portions were smaller, and treats were rare. Occasionally, honey or fresh milk could appear, but usually the child ate bread, ale, or thin porridge. Yet these small moments shaped early understanding of food, social roles, and the rhythms of labor. Children learned quickly that meals were both sustenance and ritual, that even the act of eating carried lessons about patience, cooperation, and adaptation. And for the wealthy, mornings were more than ritual or sustenance. They were theater. A noble family might enjoy breakfast in a hall adorned with tapestries, carved wooden beams, and fine metalware. Silver knives and cups glinted in the firelight. Spices traveled from distant lands, sprinkled over bread and cheese, transforming simple foods into a statement of power. Servants attended, ensuring that the meal proceeded smoothly. Even the timing of when a noble ate breakfast could signal authority. Eat too early, and you might appear eager. Too late, and you risk showing negligence. Breakfast became a subtle performance of status, a quiet yet potent form of communication. Amidst all this, the materials of eating bowls, knives, cups, trays were themselves telling. Wooden trenchers, clay jugs, metal cups, spoons carved from horn or wood. Each item bore signs of the household's wealth, the region's resources, and the craftspeople's skill. Even the simplest breakfast carried layers of meaning, not only in what was eaten but in how it was eaten, and with what tools. And finally, it's worth noting that breakfast connected people to the larger cycles of life. Seasonal foods, local availability, religious rules, and trade networks all converged in the morning meal. Each bite carried not only flavor and sustenance, but history, culture, and a sense of belonging to a specific place and time. To understand medieval breakfast is to understand medieval life itself. Its rhythms, its constraints, its creativity, and its endless ingenuity in the face of scarcity and labor. And so, as the morning light strengthens, as fields, streets, and markets come alive, the first meal of the day recedes into memory. Yet it has already set the stage for the day's work, the day's social interactions, and the day's small triumphs and struggles. The story of breakfast is more than a story of food. It is the story of life itself in the Middle Ages, in all its complexity, beauty, and quiet persistence. As the first meal fades from memory, the morning hum continues to shape life, and yet, there are subtler details that escape notice if we do not look closely. Take, for instance, the textures and flavors of the foods themselves. Bread, central to almost every household, could vary widely depending on the region, the season, and the skill of the baker. In some northern villages, the loaves were made mostly from rye or barley, heavy and dense, almost like a brick in shape with a bitter, earthy flavor. In southern regions, wheat was more common, producing lighter bread, still coarse by modern standards, but softer and slightly sweet. The smell of freshly baked bread was almost sacred in a home, a sign that the household would be fed for days, that labor would be rewarded, and that life could continue through the uncertain hours ahead. Porridge, another morning staple, held similar importance. Boiled from oats, barley, or millet, it could be thickened with milk, flavored with honey, or enriched with nuts if available. In winter, a single spoonful of porridge could sustain a child through hours of work or play, and for adults, it was essential to prevent exhaustion during long labors in the field. Sometimes, herbs were added, sage, parsley, or thyme, both for flavor and for the belief that they could ward off illness or improve digestion. Imagine stirring a bowl of porridge by a smoky fire, inhaling not only its warmth but the subtle fragrances of herbs that might have traveled from gardens or foraged forests. The act of eating itself carried ritual and etiquette, even in humble homes. While we might imagine the peasant family eating in silence, in truth, conversation occurred, punctuated by the sounds of work preparing for the day. Bread might be broken by hand, dipped in the remains of pottage, and shared with siblings or neighbors. Each movement, each exchange of food was practical, but it also reinforced family bonds, and in a small way mirrored the social hierarchies of the broader world. In monasteries, the ritual was stricter. Silence often required, each bite measured, each swallow conscious, a meditation on sustenance, humility, and gratitude. And then, there were the flavors and surprises of travel. For those who left their homes to journey on roads and rivers, breakfast became a fleeting opportunity, often consumed in discomfort, but rich in curiosity. Imagine a merchant on a spring morning, unrolling a small piece of bread, biting into it while the road shakes under a cart, inhaling the scent of distant markets and fresh fields. A pilgrim might chew on dried fruit or a thin slice of cheese, pondering the miles ahead, imagining the holy sights to be reached. Breakfast, in these moments, was not only about food, but about endurance, anticipation, and even imagination, a preparation not just for the body but for the day's journey, the day's purpose. Children's breakfasts were small yet layered with lessons. They learned what foods were available, what customs to follow, and how to share. Sometimes they were given scraps from the previous night, which taught resourcefulness. Sometimes, in moments of indulgence, a bit of honey-sweetened bread, leaving a memory of pleasure. Even the smallest act, dipping a crust in ale, licking the remnants of honey from fingers, or savoring a rare egg, connected them to the larger rhythms of medieval life, to labor, survival, and occasional delight. Meanwhile, nobles and the wealthy approached breakfast with strategy. It was not simply sustenance. It was information, connection, and subtle assertion of status. Guests might arrive early in a hall, observing the arrangements of foods, the quality of utensils, the freshness of ingredients. Even the sequence of eating mattered, perhaps bread first, then a small portion of cheese, followed by fruit, and finally, if it were a day of indulgence, honeyed pastries or spiced wine. To a medieval observer, such careful attention signaled control, refinement, and awareness of social codes. Breakfast, in this sense, was as much performance as it was nourishment. The role of seasonality cannot be overstated. Summer mornings could bring fresh fruits, strawberries, cherries, apples, or plums, eaten quickly before heading into gardens, vineyards, or fields. Autumn offered nuts, root vegetables, and preserved fruits, signaling both the bounty and the preparation for colder months. Winter mornings were harsh, with the first meal often consisting of dense bread, salted meats, and thin pottage, all consumed quickly to guard against the cold. Even the simplest ingredients carried the weight of months of preparation, of storing and drying, of thinking ahead to survive the lean seasons. Spices, when present, transformed even a modest breakfast into a subtle luxury. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg traveled thousands of miles, carried across deserts and oceans by traders, thieves, and adventurers. To sprinkle a pinch on morning bread or cheese was to taste the far reaches of the known world, and to display wealth without words. Even in small amounts, these spices carried stories of perilous journeys, dangerous seas, and distant kingdoms. The flavor was exotic, rare, and remarkable, a sharp contrast to the everyday gruel of common folk. And then there is the matter of belief, superstition, and health. Medieval people believed food influenced not only strength but character, mood, and temperament. Eggs were thought to sharpen wit, onions to fortify against sickness, leeks to purify the blood. Ale, beyond providing calories and hydration, was believed to warm the body and protect against cold. Each breakfast, therefore, was not only an act of eating but an act of preparation, a way to balance the body and mind for the challenges ahead. Finally, the morning meal, however modest or elaborate, tied each person to a larger world. From the peasant kneading rye bread by a smoky hearth, to the pilgrim nibbling cheese on a winding road, to the noble tasting honeyed pastries in a torchlit hall, breakfast reflected seasons, status, belief, and survival. Each bite carried history, and in eating, medieval people participated in the ongoing story of their society, culture, and humanity itself. As the sun climbs higher, the day unfolds, and the first meal becomes memory. The echoes of bread, pottage, cheese, and ale linger in bodies, minds, and stories. And while breakfast may seem simple, it is in fact the quiet cornerstone of life in the Middle Ages, an intimate window into a world of work, faith, connection, and survival. A world both distant and familiar, waiting for us to discover it, bite by bite, story by story. As morning progresses beyond the first meal, the echoes of breakfast linger in homes, inns, and castle halls, shaping the mood, energy, and rhythm of the day ahead. Yet the story of medieval mornings is far from complete if we do not explore the quiet, almost invisible layers that existed alongside food. The labor, the preparation, the anticipation, and even the small dramas of the household. Imagine a peasant woman standing by a hearth, stirring a pot of porridge while keeping one eye on children scrambling to get ready for their chores, one ear listening for the clatter of farm tools being readied for the fields, and another noticing the state of the firewood, damp, scarce, or sufficient for another meal. Every movement, every decision, was tied to the day's survival, and the morning meal was an integral part of this choreography. Bread, in particular, served as more than just sustenance. It was a currency of daily life, a marker of social and economic status. While the wealthy enjoyed fine, white loaves, dense and flavorful bread was the mainstay for peasants, often baked weekly or even less frequently in communal ovens. Each loaf carried the labor of growing, harvesting, grinding, and kneading grains, and even the shape and texture of the bread could tell a story: who baked it, what grains were used, and whether it had been blessed in a church ritual or prepared hurriedly for a household in need. To bite into a crusty slice was to touch the essence of survival, labor, and community in a very tangible way. In towns, breakfast began to take on new dimensions as commerce and trade expanded. Merchants arriving early at market would often carry with them small morsels of food: a piece of bread, some cheese, dried meat, or fruit. Street vendors might sell roasted chestnuts or warm pies, providing a quick, portable meal for those in transit. Unlike the rural routine of hearth and home, urban breakfast was hurried, public, and intertwined with movement, a reflection of a society increasingly defined by trade, communication, and the constant churn of daily life. And yet, even in these bustling settings, small moments of delight emerged. Imagine a baker offering a sweetened bun, glazed lightly with honey, or a merchant sharing a rare piece of dried figure. For those who could afford it, even the morning meal became a source of curiosity and pleasure, a break in the relentless demands of urban life. The availability of ingredients like sugar, almonds, and exotic fruits, once the privilege of the elite, began to trickle slowly into towns, subtly changing how people experienced food, even if only occasionally. Children in these towns experienced breakfast as a blend of practicality and play. They learned quickly to navigate limited portions, to share what was available, and occasionally to delight in small treats that were rare and memorable. Even in the simplest of meals, a crust of bread softened in ale, a thin slice of cheese, a bit of porridge, the rhythm of learning, adaptation, and early responsibility was present. Breakfast, in this sense, became both sustenance and early education, teaching children about the demands of life, the constraints of resources, and the small joys that could be found even in routine. In monasteries, breakfast reflected an entirely different philosophy. Some orders strictly forbade eating before specific hours, while others allowed small portions to sustain monks engaged in manual labor or long periods of study. Bread, ale, and sometimes fish or cheese were consumed in silence, the sound of eating subdued, the movements deliberate. Each bite was measured, mindful, a meditation on necessity and moderation. Monks' diets were carefully regulated to balance work, devotion, and health, and the morning meal became a microcosm of the disciplined life that defined monastic existence. In castles, nobles treated breakfast as both nourishment and spectacle. A hall might be arranged with an array of breads, cheeses, fruits, and occasionally meats, with servants attending to the needs of each member of the household. The wealthy might add honeyed cakes, spiced pastries, or rare delicacies imported from distant lands. Breakfast was a demonstration of wealth and influence, signaling to visitors and household members alike the resources, taste, and social position of the family. Even the order in which foods were presented or eaten could carry meaning, subtle but perceptible, reflecting etiquette, hierarchy, and the exercise of control. The role of seasonality continued to dominate. In spring, breakfast might include early fruits, fresh greens, and the first eggs of the year. Summer mornings could feature berries and vegetables from the garden, or perhaps fresh milk and cream. Autumn brought nuts, root vegetables, and preserved fruits, while winter offered the starkest meals: dense bread, salted or smoked meats, and simple pottage. Each season carried a unique flavor, a distinct rhythm, and a set of challenges, shaping the experience of the morning meal and the mood of the day. Spices, though rare, were a transformative force. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger traveled long distances, and even the tiniest sprinkle could alter a meal from ordinary to extraordinary. For the wealthy, these spices were not merely culinary. They were symbols of connection to distant lands, trade networks, and the exotic world beyond the familiar fields and villages. To taste spice at breakfast was to partake, however subtly, in a story of adventure, risk, and wealth. Finally, superstition and belief infused each meal with meaning. Foods were selected not only for sustenance but for perceived effects on the body and mind. Onions, garlic, leeks, eggs, and ale were all consumed with the understanding that they could influence health, energy, and even character. Each bite carried intention beyond hunger, a careful balance of nourishment, protection, and tradition. And so, as the morning unfolds and the first tasks of the day begin, breakfast remains quietly significant, shaping bodies, minds, and social dynamics. It is a simple meal, yet layered with history, culture, and meaning, reflecting the complexities of medieval life in every crust of bread. every spoonful of porridge, every sip of ale. The story of breakfast is the story of life itself. Humble, intricate, and deeply connected to the rhythm of work, belief, and community. As the morning stretches further, the remnants of breakfast subtly influence the day, lingering in stomachs, hands, and minds alike. Yet beyond the food itself, there is the choreography of life surrounding the meal, the movements, the preparations, the rituals that made the simple act of eating a lens into medieval society. Imagine a small village cottage where smoke from the hearth swirls and the sunlight streaming through gaps in the walls, dust motes dancing in the air, and the sounds of life gradually intensifying. Chickens clucking, a dog barking, the faint hum of neighbors beginning their work. In such a setting, breakfast is far from a passive act. It is a performance, a necessity, and a quiet moment of connection that shapes the rhythms of life to come. Bread remains central, yet its meaning and preparation vary widely. In some households, bread is baked in communal ovens once or twice a week, dense and dark, often made from rye or barley. The loaves are shaped by hand, their crusts thick, their interior chewy and hearty. A family might divide one loaf for several meals, and it is common to soak slices in ale, pottage, or even wine to soften them and stretch their sustenance. In contrast, the wealthy might enjoy white bread, sieved and fine, almost pillowy, flavored with rare ingredients and carefully portioned. Even something as seemingly simple as bread reflects the intersection of labor, wealth, and resourcefulness, telling stories of the household that produced it. Porridge, too, carries layers of complexity. Thick or thin, depending on available grains, it can be seasoned with herbs, enriched with bits of meat, or sweetened with honey or dried fruit. In winter, porridge might be a thin, watery gruel sufficient only to stave off hunger, while in the warmer months, it can be a rich and hearty concoction, sometimes shared among neighbors or children who are helping with morning chores. The variations are endless, reflecting the availability of ingredients, the skill of the cook, and even regional customs, creating a subtle tapestry of flavor, texture, and meaning. Monastic life offers another dimension. In monasteries, breakfast is not only food but discipline. Silence often dominates the dining hall, each monk mindful of the rhythm of eating, the careful measurement of portions, and the spiritual framework surrounding consumption. Bread, cheese, and ale are consumed thoughtfully, sometimes accompanied by small portions of fish or eggs for those performing laborious work. In these moments, eating transforms into meditation, a reflection of order, moderation, and the balance between physical sustenance and spiritual well-being. In towns and cities, breakfast acquires a different energy. Merchants prepare for the day's trade, often eating while moving through narrow, bustling streets. Vendors sell warm pies, roasted chestnuts, or fresh bread, offering both sustenance and small indulgences. Even travelers, tired from long journeys, find brief comfort in these meals. A slice of bread, a bit of cheese, maybe some dried fruit. Inns, though sometimes crowded and noisy, provide a momentary refuge, a place to eat, rest, and exchange information. The meal, simple though it may be, becomes a hub for social interaction, commerce, and observation, connecting strangers in transient but meaningful ways. Children, whether in villages, towns, or castles, experience breakfast as both necessity and learning. Small portions teach patience, sharing, and the rhythms of life. Rare treats, honey, eggs, or milk, are moments of joy, often remembered long after the taste has faded. Through these meals, children absorb lessons in resourcefulness, social hierarchy, and even taste, forming early memories that will shape their approach to food and community. For nobles, breakfast is both sustenance and a subtle performance of status. The arrangement of foods, the quality of utensils, the presence of exotic spices, and the timing of the meal all signal wealth, refinement, and control. Trenchers of bread, honeyed cakes, spiced pastries, and rare delicacies communicate quietly yet powerfully the family's position. Even the smallest detail, a knife made of silver, a cup of finely crafted metal, carries meaning, emphasizing authority, taste, and the subtle politics of daily life. Seasonality continues to dominate all aspects of breakfast. Spring offers fresh herbs, early vegetables, and the first eggs of the year. Summer brings berries, garden vegetables, and fresh milk. Autumn introduces preserved fruits, nuts, and root vegetables, while winter presents the starkest challenges. Dense bread, salted meats, and thin pottage, consumed quickly to protect against cold and fatigue. Each season molds the flavor, texture, and nutritional value of breakfast, linking the meal inextricably to the land and its cycles. Even the rarest ingredients reveal stories of connection, trade, and status. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger traveled thousands of miles from distant lands, their presence in a morning meal a testament to wealth, adventure, and global networks. A sprinkle of spice on bread or cheese was a reminder of the broader world, of merchants, sailors, and caravans navigating dangers to deliver flavors that would transform a simple meal into something remarkable. Beliefs about food further shaped the medieval breakfast. Each ingredient carried supposed effects on health, energy, and temperament. Onions and garlic fortified the body against illness. Eggs sharpened the mind. Ale provided warmth and sustenance. Eating was never neutral. It was always purposeful, blending nutrition, superstition, and tradition. The morning meal became a subtle negotiation between need, habit, and belief, grounding people physically and mentally for the day ahead. And so, as the sun climbs and activity spreads across fields, villages, and towns, the quiet influence of breakfast continues to ripple outward. It shapes labor, social interaction, education, and even the imagination. The morning meal, humble or lavish, is a lens through which we glimpse the complexity of medieval life, its rhythms, struggles, joys, and ingenuity. Through every crust of bread, every spoonful of porridge, and every sip of ale, we see not only nourishment but a story of survival, creativity, and human connection that persists in echoes across centuries. As the morning light stretches across villages, towns, and castles, the influence of breakfast subtly shapes the unfolding day. Yet beyond the simple act of eating, there are layers of preparation, habit, and subtle social performance that give the morning meal its enduring significance. Picture a small peasant household at this hour. The smoke from the hearth rises, catching the first sunbeams. Children are quietly finishing their morsels of bread and ale, perhaps nibbling on a thin slice of cheese or savoring the last drops of warm porridge. The mother tends the fire, ensuring a fresh pot is ready for later, while the father sharpens a tool for the day's labor. Every movement is purposeful, measured, yet infused with the quiet energy of routine. Bread remains the cornerstone, and its preparation is a daily or weekly ritual that dominates household life. Coarse loaves, dense and hearty, made from rye or barley, provide sustenance for days. Each loaf tells a story: the season in which the grain was harvested, the skill of the baker, and the effort required to produce it. In wealthier homes, bread is lighter, crafted from finely sifted wheat, sometimes enriched with eggs, milk, or butter, a luxury that contrasts sharply with the daily realities of peasant diets. In all cases, bread represents more than food. It embodies labor, ingenuity, and the small triumphs of survival in a world without modern conveniences. Porridge, made from oats, barley, or millet, is another essential breakfast item. Its consistency varies with region, season, and availability of ingredients, from thick, hearty bowls to thinner, almost watery gruels. Herbs, nuts, and sometimes dried fruits add flavor and nutrition when available, and in winter, it may be all that sustains a family through long hours of labor. The act of stirring porridge over an open fire, inhaling the warmth and aromas, and portioning it among family members is itself a quiet ritual, linking nourishment to care, attention, and the rhythms of domestic life. In towns, breakfast takes on a more public character. Merchants and laborers consume their meals quickly, often while on the move, in narrow streets where the day's work begins immediately. Street vendors offer pies, roasted nuts, and warm bread, a fleeting indulgence for those hurrying to markets or workshops. Inns provide temporary respite for travelers who might consume a crust of bread, a slice of cheese, or a thin portion of pottage while exchanging news, rumors, or advice about roads, weather, and distant events. In these moments, breakfast becomes a point of connection, a brief intersection of lives otherwise separated by labor, distance, or class. Children experience breakfast differently, their portions smaller but their attention keen. They learn to share, to adapt to limited ingredients, and occasionally to delight in rare treats. A drop of honey, a fresh egg, or a piece of fruit when available. These small pleasures leave lasting impressions, teaching lessons about patience, resourcefulness, and the subtleties of social hierarchy, as even the smallest portion may reflect status, opportunity, or favor. Monasteries, by contrast, treat breakfast as a disciplined, almost sacred activity. Silence often dominates the hall, and every motion is deliberate, every bite mindful. Bread, cheese, ale, and sometimes fish are consumed in measured portions, serving both physical nourishment and spiritual reflection. Here, eating is not merely about satisfying hunger, but about observing order, cultivating patience, and integrating sustenance into a structured, contemplative life. Noble households transform breakfast into a stage of subtle performance. Tables laden with fine breads, cheeses, fruits, and occasionally spiced meats communicate wealth, taste, and status. Exotic spices, rare pastries, and honeyed cakes serve not only as food, but as symbols of connections to distant lands, powerful merchants, and the ability to command luxury. Servants attend meticulously, ensuring every detail aligns with etiquette, hierarchy, and display, turning the simple morning meal into a theater of refinement and control. Seasonality continues to shape the meal. Spring mornings bring fresh greens, early fruits, and the first eggs of the year. Summer adds berries, vegetables, and dairy products. Autumn offers preserved fruits, nuts, and root vegetables. Winter demands ingenuity with dense bread, salted meats, and simple pottage. Each season imposes both limitations and possibilities, linking breakfast to the land, climate, and cycles of survival. Even the rarest ingredients carry stories of connection and ambition. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger arrive from distant lands, transported by caravans, ships, and traders willing to brave dangers for profit and prestige. A simple sprinkle of spice transforms a loaf of bread or a slice of cheese into a luxurious experience, a reminder of global networks, exotic places, and the ingenuity required to bring the world's flavors to a local table. Beliefs and superstitions also play a role. Foods are selected not only for taste but for supposed effects on health, energy, and character. Onions, garlic, and leeks fortify the body. Eggs sharpen the mind. Ale warms and protects. Each bite is intentional, blending practicality with tradition, superstition, and philosophy, linking sustenance to the moral and physical well-being of the eater. As the morning advances, the traces of breakfast linger. Satisfied appetites, prepared minds, and energized bodies ready for work, travel, or study. From peasant cottages to bustling towns, from silent monasteries to grand castles, breakfast reveals the intricate weave of medieval life. Necessity, ritual, creativity, and social order. Each meal, each bite, carries meaning, connecting the individual to family, community, and the broader rhythms of existence. The story of breakfast is not merely the story of food. It is the story of life itself in a world defined by labor, survival, and subtle artistry. And so, the quiet echoes of the first meal fade into the unfolding day. Yet its influence persists in every task, conversation, and movement that follows. A reminder that even in the simplest act of eating, there is history, culture, and the enduring human pursuit of nourishment, comfort, and connection. As the morning stretches onward, the memory of breakfast subtly blends with the sounds, smells, and motions of medieval life, shaping both body and mind for the day ahead. In villages, the rhythmic clatter of tools, the lowing of cattle, and the murmurs of people carrying out daily tasks form a symphony of labor that rises from the hearth to the fields. Breakfast, though fleeting, has set a tone. The energy to tend animals, the focus to work the land, and the quiet cohesion that holds families and communities together. Even in the smallest cottage, the act of eating has significance far beyond nourishment. It is a preparation for survival, a reinforcement of habit, and a subtle training in patience and observation. Bread, always central, carries meaning far beyond its simple composition. Dense loaves of rye or barley, dark and earthy, tell the story of a family's labor over weeks, from sowing seeds to grinding flour and kneading dough. In wealthier homes, white bread made from finely sifted wheat is enriched with eggs, butter, or milk, demonstrating both skill and status. Even the humblest loaf has character. The texture, the crust, and the aroma speak to the quality of ingredients, the skill of the baker, and the environment in which it was made. A bite of bread is, in a sense, a taste of the landscape itself, imbued with months of labor and the particularities of the season. Porridge, another staple, offers both sustenance and versatility. Made from oats, barley, or millet, it can be thick or thin, savory or lightly sweetened, depending on availability and circumstance. Herbs such as sage or thyme may enhance flavor, while nuts or dried fruits, if accessible, provide texture and nutrition. Children often eat small portions, learning early to stretch ingredients, appreciate scarcity, and savor the occasional treat. Porridge may seem mundane to a modern observer, yet in medieval mornings, it was essential. A warm, sustaining, and adaptable meal that grounded individuals for hours of physical or intellectual work. In towns and cities, breakfast takes on a more communal and dynamic dimension. Street vendors sell warm pies, roasted chestnuts, and bread to travelers, laborers, and merchants on the move. Inns offer brief respite for pilgrims or traders who may consume a quick meal while exchanging news, gossip, or advice about markets, routes, or political events. In these moments, breakfast becomes both sustenance and social nexus, connecting diverse individuals in fleeting but meaningful encounters. The hurried consumption of bread and cheese, perhaps accompanied by thin ale or weak wine, contrasts with the quiet, deliberate meals of peasant cottages or monastery halls, yet each serves the purpose of fueling the day while maintaining social cohesion. Children's breakfasts reveal subtle lessons in hierarchy, sharing, and resourcefulness. Limited portions teach them to anticipate scarcity and distribute food wisely, while rare treats, such as honey or eggs, offer moments of delight and pleasure. Observing adults, children learn the rhythms of domestic life, the importance of communal responsibility, and even the nuanced etiquette of sharing and receiving sustenance. These early interactions, often overlooked in historical accounts, were formative in shaping character, resilience, and social intelligence. Monasteries approach breakfast with discipline and reflection. Silent halls, deliberate movements, and mindful consumption characterize these meals, transforming a simple act into meditation. Bread, cheese, and ale are consumed in measured portions, sometimes accompanied by fish or eggs for those engaged in laborious tasks. Monks view breakfast not merely as sustenance but as an integral part of their spiritual regimen, balancing bodily needs with religious devotion. Eating becomes an exercise in patience, order, and attention, linking nourishment to moral and spiritual development. In noble households, breakfast is simultaneously practical and performative. Tables laden with fine breads, cheeses, fruits, and occasionally spiced pastries demonstrate both wealth and taste. The presence of exotic spices, such as cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg, signals connections to distant trade networks and the ability to access rare commodities. Servants attend meticulously, ensuring that the sequence of serving, the presentation of dishes, and the utensils used reflect hierarchy and social propriety. Breakfast here is both food and subtle theater, reinforcing social order and signaling status without a word spoken. Seasonality dictates the flavors and textures of breakfast across all levels of society. Spring mornings bring fresh greens, early fruits, and the first eggs, while summer introduces berries, vegetables, and fresh dairy. Autumn provides preserved fruits, nuts, and root vegetables, and winter demands ingenuity with dense bread, salted meats, and thin pottage. Each season transforms ingredients, requiring adaptation and ingenuity, linking breakfast to agricultural cycles and the unpredictable patterns of weather and harvest. Even the rarest spices and ingredients are imbued with stories of exploration, trade, and human ambition. A pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg on morning bread not only adds flavor but evokes the journeys of traders and adventurers, the dangers of distant lands, and the desire to taste something beyond immediate surroundings. Breakfast, therefore, is simultaneously local and global, rooted in the immediate household yet connected to distant realms through the movement of goods and knowledge. Beliefs about food permeate breakfast, influencing selection and preparation. Onions, garlic, and leeks fortify the body. Eggs sharpen the mind. Ale warms and protects. Each meal is a careful negotiation between sustenance, health, and superstition, blending practical nourishment with cultural and spiritual expectations. In these ways, breakfast becomes more than food. It is ritual, instruction, and preparation, shaping body, mind, and community in subtle, enduring ways. And so, as the sun climbs and the day's labor intensifies, the first meal continues to exert its quiet influence. From the peasant's humble hearth to the bustling urban streets, from monastic halls to noble dining rooms, breakfast connects people to land, season, culture, and one another. Each crust of bread, each spoonful of porridge, each sip of ale tells a story of survival, creativity, and the intricate weave of medieval life. The echoes of these mornings remind us that even the simplest acts of eating are rich with meaning, shaping the rhythm, character, and texture of a day that stretches long and demanding before every individual. As the day moves forward, the memory of breakfast begins to mingle with the activities, sounds, and subtle tensions of medieval life, almost like an undercurrent shaping everything else. Even after the last spoon of porridge is consumed, the aroma of bread, the faint sweetness of honey, and the warmth of ale linger in rooms, streets, and halls, influencing mood, stamina, and interactions. In villages, mothers and fathers move quickly from tending to children to preparing tools, animals, and fields for labor, while children chase small animals or fetch water, carrying with them traces of the morning meal. Every bite, every sip, Even every crumb left on a plate contributes to the rhythm of daily survival and social life, shaping energy and focus in ways we often overlook. Bread, in all its forms, continues to play a central role. In peasant cottages, loaves are still dense and hearty, darkened by rye, barley, or sometimes a mixture of grains that were available after harvest. The crust may be thick, almost as hard as a brick, while the interior is moist but coarse. A loaf might serve multiple days, sliced sparingly, sometimes softened in ale or pottage, sometimes eaten dry, with the flavors deepened by time and slight fermentation. In wealthier households, bread is lighter, occasionally enriched with eggs, butter, or milk. Its texture is softer, its aroma delicate, and it is often sliced or torn with a ceremony that emphasizes order, etiquette, and refinement. Even the smallest bite reflects not only sustenance but attention to detail, culture, and social positioning. Porridge remains adaptable and revealing of household priorities. Thickened with grains, enriched with nuts, sweetened with honey, or spiced lightly, it demonstrates ingenuity and practicality. Children often learn early to make do with smaller portions, savoring whatever they can while observing patterns of preparation, the subtle hierarchy in serving, and even the social rules about sharing. For peasants, a morning meal might be minimal, but even a few spoonfuls of porridge provide essential energy for hours of labor, teaching endurance, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of necessity fulfilled. In towns, breakfast gains additional complexity. Streets are crowded, smells mingle, bread baking in ovens, roasted meats sizzling on open flames, the faint aroma of herbs and ale drifting from taverns. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers take quick bites on the move, perhaps dipping a piece of bread into warm pottage or nibbling a slice of cheese. Inns offer brief refuge for travelers, providing simple yet sufficient nourishment while news, rumors, and local happenings are exchanged. Even in these hurried moments, breakfast retains its subtle role, sustaining energy, offering fleeting pleasure, and serving as a bridge between personal need and the wider social fabric. Children in towns navigate these meals with curiosity and instinct. They observe, imitate, and learn to anticipate scarcity or abundance. A rare taste of honey, a soft piece of cheese, or a warm nut might be a treasured moment, remembered not only for flavor but for the small lessons embedded in sharing, resourcefulness, and etiquette. Even the seemingly mundane act of eating becomes an education in patience, observation, and social awareness, forming a foundation for later life. Monasteries offer an entirely different approach to breakfast. Silence dominates the refectory, movements are deliberate, and portions measured. Bread, cheese, ale, or occasionally fish are consumed in reflection, emphasizing moderation, focus, and spiritual discipline. Every action is considered, every bite mindful. Eating becomes both physical nourishment and spiritual exercise, linking the body to the larger rhythm of prayer, labor, and study. The flavor of bread or the warmth of ale is less about indulgence and more about alignment with a deliberate, ordered life. Nobles approach breakfast as a subtle performance of wealth, taste, and hierarchy. Tables are arranged with breads, cheeses, fruits, spiced pastries, and occasionally rare meats. Exotic spices, though used sparingly, signal access to global trade and distant lands. The sequence of serving, the utensils chosen, and even the placement of plates communicate messages of power and refinement. Breakfast is simultaneously sustenance and spectacle, a quiet yet powerful reinforcement of social norms, influence, and status. Seasonality dictates flavors, ingredients, and practices. Spring brings tender greens, early fruits, and the first eggs. Summer offers berries, fresh milk, and vegetables. Autumn yields preserved fruits, nuts, and root vegetables, while winter demands resourcefulness. Dense bread, salted meats, and thin pottage dominate, prepared with care to sustain families through cold and labor. These seasonal variations tie breakfast to the land, climate, and cycles of human effort, making it a living reflection of both environmental conditions and cultural adaptation. Rare ingredients carry stories of adventure and connection. A pinch of cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves is more than flavor. It evokes the risks of trade, long journeys by caravan and ship, and the human desire to access distant worlds. Even a small sprinkle transforms a simple meal into a connection with global networks, ambition, and discovery. Breakfast, therefore, is simultaneously local and cosmopolitan, humble and aspirational, anchoring life in practical need while opening windows to imagination and wider horizons. Beliefs, superstition, and health influence choices. Onions, leeks, and garlic protect against illness. Eggs sharpen the mind. Ale warms and sustains. Each bite, sip, or morsel carries intention, blending survival, culture, and tradition. Breakfast is never simply food. It is preparation, instruction, and subtle ritual, linking body, mind, and social context. As the morning continues, these small acts ripple outward. Energy supports labor, moods shape interactions, and the subtleties of preparation, consumption, and etiquette influence the unfolding day. From the quiet cottage to bustling town streets, from monastic halls to noble tables, breakfast reflects and shapes the medieval world. Every loaf, every spoonful, every sip carries a story of human endurance, ingenuity, and culture, reminding us that even the simplest acts of eating are intertwined with the rhythm, complexity, and texture of life itself.